and Matthew chapter 16 verses 13 to 20. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets." Then he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. These are the words of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Helen and Don, for bringing us the readings. I wonder if any of you watched that program on Channel 10 that's called Have You Been Paying Attention?, which is a sort of light-hearted look back over the week of current affairs and things that have been happening in the world. Well, it's as if Jesus in this reading is having a go at the similar thing and asking the disciples, well, have you been paying attention? Have you been listening to what I've been saying? Have you been watching what I've been doing? And have you been hearing what the crowds and the people around have been saying about me? So he asks them then the question, well, who do these crowds say that I am? What's their thinking? And the response is that, well, they think you're a prophet, Jesus. They think you're either a bit like John the Baptist, who's a recent contemporary prophet, or maybe you're like Elijah, perhaps Israel's most famous prophet who also healed people a bit like Jesus does. Or perhaps you're even like Jeremiah, who warned of future disasters coming, and Jesus does a little bit of that as well. So the crowds are actually onto a good thing here. They're recognising that Jesus does speak and act like a prophet. But Jesus doesn't leave it there. He then turns to the disciples and says, well, how about you folk? You're the ones who've been with me the most. You're the ones who've seen, right up close what it is I've been saying and doing. So who do you think I am? And Peter, of course it's Peter, comes back with the response that, well, Jesus, we think you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Peter's actually the first human in the story up until this point to make that connection. I mean, as the reader, we know, because we were told right at the very beginning of the gospel that this is the story of Jesus the Messiah. So we've known from the beginning. And at Jesus' baptism, you hear the voice from heaven, this is my son. But this is the first time one of the human characters twigs and says, you're the Messiah, Jesus. And in some ways, that's a surprising conclusion for Peter to come to, because the Messiah was expected to do certain things and act in certain ways that are not what Jesus is doing. So the Messiah was supposed to defeat the enemies of Israel. So in this case, it would be the Romans in a military sort of way. Jesus isn't doing that. The Messiah is meant to restore the worship of God in the temple at Jerusalem. And Jesus hasn't done any of that to this point. And the Messiah is meant to usher in this period of unprecedented peace and well-being and prosperity. And that doesn't seem to be happening either. And yet Peter has this inkling, he's given this insight that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. And Jesus says, well done, Peter, you've got it. You know, go to the top of the class. And this confession becomes the bedrock of Christian faith. And in some ways, that's why Peter is named Petros, the rock, the stone, because our Christian faith is built on this confession that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. And it's why we, the followers of Jesus, are known as Christians, because we follow the ways of Christ. And Christ is simply the Greek translation of the Hebrew Messiah. So that's why we're called Christians. But of course, the very fact that I need to explain that to us means that our contemporaries are going to struggle to understand sort of anything about the Messiah. It's not a term, it's not a role that anyone other than Jewish people would really understand. So we have to probably find other ways of describing our faith and other ways of describing who Jesus is. And I wrote in the Facebook post for this week that really that's what our New Testament is all about. It's trying to give us multiple ways of understanding who Jesus is, because that is kind of like the key question that the New Testament is trying to answer. It then goes on and explores other questions. Depending how you answer who is Jesus, well then who is God and how are we to live and so forth. But I think the challenge from this reading in a way is for each of us to develop a way of understanding who Jesus is for us. You know, in the early 21st century, in the middle of a COVID pandemic, who is Jesus for us? And maybe Jesus is for you, the Messiah and the Son of the living God. But maybe Jesus is the companion who walks with you through difficult times. Maybe Jesus is the one who gives you peace in your heart. There are many ways that we might understand who Jesus is. And each of us needs to, I guess, come to our own understanding and then be prepared to share that with others. But however we answer that question, and it's an important question, we don't get any prizes for getting our theology just right or just so. Most people aren't interested in our theology. They're much more interested in how we live, how we treat other people, how we interact with the people around us. And that's where the Romans reading comes in. And Paul says that we've got to, I guess, learn first of all not to be totally shaped by the world and the values of the world and the priorities of the world. Some translations say, don't let the world squeeze you into its own mould. Instead, Paul says, we need to be humble. We need to recognise that there's always more for us to learn. More to learn about Jesus, more to learn about how we're to live, how we're to love our neighbour. And then Paul says, oh, and by the way, something that's really important is that we all have gifts. We all have certain talents that God has given us and that we've developed. And Paul says, well, use those according to the faith that you have. Use them to encourage those around you. Use them to build up those around you. Whatever your gift is, whether it's serving or whether it's teaching or whether it's giving or he gives a list, and we could probably add several to his list. He's saying, whatever it is, use that gift, use the talents that you have to influence those around you for good. And that, in a way, is the way we show our worship of God. So it's important for each of us to, I guess, try and work out and name for ourselves who Jesus is. But then it's equally important that we live out that faith, and we live it out in a way that reflects God's character and God's love and grace and mercy and kindness and justice and all those things in how we then interact with others. And at the end of the day, Paul says, well, that is our act of worship that we offer to God and to the world each and every day, not just for 1 hour on Sunday, but through the 24/7 of the week.